So what is the feminization of academia all about? Just to, summarize it, and I have summarized it this way, it's the elevation of the values of the nursery and the kindergarten over the traditional, established, customary values of the academy, which have been a long time in the making of, and are predominant in the West, of course, of truth-seeking, of rigor, of, empiricism, of, disagreement, sportsmanlike, rigorous, vigorous disagreement and argumentation and reason, and all of that. And women, not just women, but also, minorities as well, that's sort of a third wheel here that's turning, have questioned those values and I think actively sought to undermine them in their kind of safetyist, anti-free expression, anti-First Amendment ethos, which, isn't just rooted in feminism, but in a much broader far-left ideology that is critical of, paternalistic values, masculinity in general. It's really a sweeping critique. And those people have gotten the upper hand. One very recent example, because this just, we think we have seen a shift since October 7th, but the old ideas refuse to die. The Harvard social science dean, Lawrence Bobo, just said, academics who cause scrutiny and criticism of our institution, whose statements elicit that attention, they're not protected by academic free expression values or, First Amendment values. They've betrayed us. They're going to be punished. I mean, that's safetyism kind of writ large. And it's the insularity. We need to protect people from upsetting ideas, bad ideas. We need to draw lines so that we can maintain, our control and maintain a sort of warm bath atmosphere here at Harvard. That whole attitude, which sells First Amendment values, open expression values down the river or demotes it. I think this is a matter of re-scrambling the hierarchy, really, of what's more important and what's less important. And that has a pervasive influence on academia today. And we see it in the wider society, of course.
Do you think that there are any advantages to the feminization of these institutions?
Very few. I think, one aspect that I have spoken of is the fairness element of opening institutions to people from whatever background, whatever gender. That wasn't the practice decades ago. It's a relatively recent phenomenon. It applies not just to women, but also to minorities. The problem is when those people come in, they bring in their values and their prejudices and their priorities, and then they insist upon implementing them as a kind of lemma or corollary of being allowed to enter and participate and compete. The whole idea of competition is, of course, under attack. And I have stated, and I still believe this, maybe I'm naive, people tell me I am, I just don't get it, that the men who had control of the academy and, dominated it really in recent times, this phenomenon is just decades old, I think, the feminist takeover, the feminization. They should have resisted. I still don't understand why they gave in so readily to these demands and these values. I guess the short answer is they were as captured by this left-leaning ideology as, they are lefties. I mean, academia is a stronghold now of far-left ideas. Wonderful essay recently in National Affair by Steve Tellis, who's at Johns Hopkins, who, acknowledges this, brings together all of the social science and materials that show that this is the case. And I guess they just either felt they couldn't resist, lacked the confidence to resist, weren't sure about whether the critique held any water. There was a lack of cultural confidence there. Personally, I think a lack of manliness, frankly, although people bristle when you use that term, to resist. You don't push back against the ladies. Well, you have to, especially when the ladies come to the fore. They don't stay in their separate sphere. You have to say, I'm sorry, girls, but you're not going to get your way on this.
I suppose this is one of the sometimes subtle ways in which women have always had power in society. We have power through men, right? That men will often find it difficult to. There's an urge to impress women. There's an urge to be
Accommodating.
yeah, and obviously with exceptions, but a lot of men have that sort of yes, they will behave differently when women are around. And this is one of the ways in which women have always had often invisible but nonetheless important modes of power.
It's the downside of chivalry. And
Right.
I mean, chivalry was kept within bounds because women were kept within bounds. I mean, let's be quite clear, there were many restrictions on women, collective restrictions on women and norms that held them back. And once those dissolved, chivalry became dysfunctional, because it goes too far. It's funny because one of my favorite expressions, and when I teach my students, I teach a course in conservative political and legal thought, which, is quite a heavy lift of a course there. But I always quote Lord Patrick Devlin, who was a conservative jurist in Britain in the late part of the 19th, early part of the 20th century. He said in his debate with H.L.A. Hart, and there's so much wisdom here, fornication will never be wiped out. Well, back then, fornication was considered, very undesirable. It will never be wiped out. The key is to keep it within bounds.
Mm-hmm.
And that expression, to keep it within bounds, is such a wonderful, useful, all-purpose trope for how we ought to govern our society, and how we ought to govern academia, our institutions, vis-a-vis the demands of, the preferences of any given group that stood outside but now comes in to the equation. So yeah, men were in charge, but see, I have no problem with men being in charge because I see civilization as primarily the product of male efforts, imagination, drive, ability. I think it still is in many ways, and I think it will continue to be. So, to channel Camille Paglia, if we didn't have men, we'd all be sitting around in grass huts beating on tom-toms. They're the ones who've taken us out of that and created this glorious prosperity, the systems that we enjoy and take for granted. I think we ought to be a lot more grateful to men, show a lot more gratitude to men for their strengths and contributions than we do now. Of course, that's very unfashionable.